Water brought most of our ancestors to this continent. And water took them westward into it. Water was their road to freedom and sometimes riches, their source of inspiration and adventure. That's also true on the driftwood for a group of young people right out of college. With video cameras, they embarked on a 25,000-mile voyage, gathering stories along the way. Their adventure took 3 years and covered the eastern part of North America from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico. They wanted to find out how the waterways influence our lives, and in turn, what we have done to the water. Travel with them to visit the places and meet the people they discovered along the way. Like the woman who has lived her entire life on an island 40 miles out in Lake Michigan. A young couple who like spending time under the Illinois River. And a former steel worker from Chicago who symbolizes the will to overcome. Join them on this leg of their journey as they explore Lake Michigan and head down the Illinois to the mighty Mississippi. There's a story behind this story. It all began as an idea shared by a father and a son. But the son, an award-winning filmmaker, died in an auto accident. His father decided to go ahead with the project as a kind of memorial. He bought a 60-foot motor yacht, named it Driftwood, and outfitted it with television equipment. He hired a professional crew to run the boat. On this part of the trip, it was headed by Captain Richard Bristol. Then he selected teams of Canadian and U.S. college graduates, young people who, like his son, wanted to share their discoveries with others. They signed on for about a month each. They got room and board, a salary, and a chance to help document what they saw on the waters. On this trip, the young shooters were both Canadians. Kathy Bradford signed on after graduating in TV broadcasting from Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario.
Not only was I excited about having the experience of using the equipment, I was fascinated by just traveling by boat.
Her classmate Bill Arnold was selected as one of the first Driftwood interns and became a permanent member of the video crew.
Here we are traveling routes that were used 200, 300 years ago.
And that was certainly true as they headed toward Lake Michigan, the most populated and most used of the Great Lakes. At its northern end, the lake divides Michigan's Upper Peninsula from the rest of the state at the Straits of Mackinac. Some people say the UP never really was a part of Michigan until the Mackinac Bridge was completed in 1957. Big Mac is the longest suspension bridge in the world.
I felt as though I was a pebble in the ocean. You see photographs, postcards of the bridge, but you can't actually capture the actual feeling is that when you're traveling under it. The size of it is just massive. It's huge. And something of that size is also very beautiful.
People have been living along this waterway for centuries. The French were the first Europeans to recognize the strategic significance of the Straits of Mackinac. With cannons set there on the mainland, they could control access to both Lakes Michigan and Huron. So in 1715, a detachment of 20 French soldiers built Fort Michilimackinac, and with it, a town grew.
The French walked into an area, virgin country, where the furs were prime.
Dr. Donald Heldman is an archaeologist working for the state of Michigan. He and others have been digging in and restoring Fort Michilimackinac for 30 years.
When we were going around the excavation sites and looking at the dig, it was just incredible to think of the things that they were finding there.
Below this Heading down through this clay to this point is the British period.
Don Heldman was excavating a house owned by the first Jewish trader in Michigan. Ezekiel Solomon arrived in 1761, just as the French and Indian War was ending. The defeated French were preparing to hand over the fort and the Straits of Mackinac to the British. Solomon's trading post did well. After a time, he took a partner named Levy. One thing they were not was neat.
Well, within the Solomon Levy house, we found 75,000 artifacts. A lot of stuff. I must tell you, it's one of the richest archaeological sites I've ever seen, and I've worked all over the world. This blue glass bead is a faceted bead, and one which the Indians simply had an insatiable desire for. They could never wear enough beads.
The Indians also wanted guns.
This is a 56, 57 caliber bullet made specifically for an Indian trade gun. It would fit most of the trade guns of the era, which were traded to the Indians. We found these things by the thousands. In fact, they were making them in the house, in the fireplace.
Not only did Ezekiel Solomon leave behind a wealth of information, but he lived a charmed life. He survived a massacre here.
Here, immediately behind me, on June the 2nd, 1763, the Indians staged a Waterway game. That is a lacrosse game, a game much like lacrosse.
But the game was just a trick, which had the Indians pretending to throw the ball over the stockade fence accidentally.
The third time the ball went over, the man went to retrieve the ball as he had the other times, but in a coordinated effort, the Indians suddenly seized and began killing, began stabbing and began shooting and began tomahawking the British garrison both here and on the inside, and very quickly overcame the two guards at the gate. Solomon was one of the few to survive. There were several others who miraculously survived, probably because they were not accused of taking advantage of the Indians or being, for lack of a better term, racist toward the Indians.
If he were to come back here today, Ezekiel Solomon would have a hard time recognizing his old lakefront settlement. His store is surrounded now by modern trading posts. They sell plastic beads and something else that Indians never had, fudge. Mackinac City is the jumping-off place for Mackinac Island, the area's major tourist attraction. The island once was the center of John Jacob Astor's fur trading empire. For a long time, its grand hotel and charm made it a premier vacation spot. Today, it's a crowded and kitschy tourist haven. Yet one island Ezekiel Solomon might still recognize is Beaver, largest of the 6 inhabited islands in Lake Michigan. Lying 19 miles from the nearest point of land, it remains pretty much unspoiled. Driftwood put in at Beaver Island on a late summer afternoon. The harbor town has 2 stores and 2 bars, not a fudge shop in sight. In winter, when the lake freezes, the ferry boat shuts down. Then, the only way on or off this island is by plane, when the weather isn't too stormy or foggy, and when local dogs will let you taxi down the runway.
I got a kick out of one of the ladies that we interviewed was Mary Tom, who has lived there all her life.
Mary Tom, that's what everyone calls her, so as not to confuse her with other Marys on the island. Mary Tom recalls that her ancestors came here to escape the potato famine at home.
30 families came from Ireland at one time. My dad's people were one of the families. My husband's name was Tom, and Gatliff is my married name, but everyone called me Mary Tom. My dad was a blacksmith. He used to build boats. They did everything to make a living. They had to.
Mary did her part. She had 13 babies, most of whom did not have the luxury of a doctor in attendance.
That's Danny and Ellen. He's gone. He died years ago. And both of them are gone. Yeah, and that's my dad.
For the people who grew up with Mary Tom, life was good on Beaver Island, but making a living was never easy. That tension makes Beaver Island a place of sharp contrasts, great natural beauty versus isolation. Mary Tom has seen the kind of island fever that comes to folks here. Every once in a while, she felt the urge to get away, and she'd take off for the bright lights of Chicago, Detroit, or California. But she always came back to her Lake Michigan island. It had a hold on her.
I think the people has a lot to do with it, too, you know. Everyone that ever lived here always come back.
Romantic as that sounds, moving to a place like this can be a real challenge, especially if you hope to make a living. But there are people willing to try. The Driftwood crew found Mike and Jane Bailey. They'd spent many summers here working at a lodge owned by Jane's parents, but this is a time of transition for them. The Baileys are expecting their first child, they're taking over the business, and looking forward to their first winter on Beaver Island.
It's refreshing to see a young couple, instead of going to the big city, go out to an island and keep their own business and start a family.
Mike's the chef at the Beaver Lodge. Jane handles the business. There's plenty to do in the warm months, but after Labor Day, life changes.
The off-season here is wonderful. You have a chance to really enjoy nature, and there's not a lot of mopeds and cars and dust flying on the roads. It's just very, very peaceful.
People actually here live for the off-season. People out here are really into being outside. The off-season means for me a chance to sail.
But when snow is waist deep around their lodge and it's time for the baby and there's no doctor on the island, then what?
When your pains are 7 minutes apart or thereabouts, you call the airport, call the hospital, and there's an evacuation plane that can go at any time for medical emergencies.
The Baileys figure that between the baby and their business, they won't have idle time during the winter. Other Beaver Island residents aren't so lucky.
They say almost everybody on the island will have a drinking problem, has had a drinking problem, or does have a drinking problem.
Perhaps the Baileys should have Mary Tom over for dinner one night soon. She'd love to talk about adjusting to life on an island in the middle of Lake Michigan.
Tell them to come up and see me, and I'll tell them the truth. It's just what you make it. You can have a good time or you can have a bad time, yeah.
Like anywhere else, it's not the place that makes the person. From Beaver Island, the Driftwood headed south into Grand Traverse Bay, where the crew met some people whose Lake Michigan roots are even deeper than the Irish settlers of Beaver Island.
My name is Tony Miller. I grew up in Shabbytown, which is about 20 miles north of Traverse City.
Fishing was part of the Chippewa and Ottawa life of the upper Great Lakes long before the first European explorers arrived. Later on, after the American Revolution, the Indians made treaties with the new government in Washington. These treaties granted the Indians fishing and hunting rights for as long as the sun rises and the rivers flow. Over the years, those rights eroded away. Finally, individual Indians who insisted on fishing to make a living found themselves arrested or worse. Yet a few persisted on their own. Tony Miller is fishing today only because of a Supreme Court ruling that Michigan must respect Indian treaty rights. As a result, the best whitefish waters were returned to the Indians. The Lady Hilma is owned by the tribe.
We always hear stories of alcohol and gambling and whatnot. Indians have a bad rap put on them, but when you see these guys working out, it's not true. I mean, they're making a living, and they're doing really well at it.
Last year, the Lady Hilma took in about 110,000 pounds of fish.
This year we hope to catch maybe 150,000 pounds. And they're sold to a company out of Brethren, Michigan. And he picks them up on the dock every day. A lot more jobs available now. There's also a lot more people moving into the area. You can look anywhere out here and just see houses all over the place.
I was thrilled to see that they were actually working and running their own business and making a good living.
I think it's definitely a sign of good hope for them.
There's a twist to this story: pollution. Apparently, the whitefish caught by the Indians are safe to eat. That's what Michigan's Department of Natural Resources says. But not so for the fish sportsmen take from these same waters. Michigan tests the trout and salmon, and what it finds is not good. The state warns people against eating them. The problem is toxins carried on the wind and waters that enter the lake from all directions. Traveling on this immense inland sea, you can feel the size of that problem. It covers more than 22,000 square miles, and at its deepest is over 900 feet. Over 100 rivers and streams empty into Lake Michigan. Every day, some 9 million people drink her water. In fact, it is America's largest body of fresh water and the only one of the Great Lakes lying entirely within the boundaries of the United States. It is part of the reason why more boats are registered in Michigan than any other state in the Union.
And it's a large recreation lake. There are thousands, literally thousands of people that spend the weekends on Lake Michigan. What we set out to do was locate one of the families that spend their time on Lake Michigan. That's how we found the McIntyres. They live in Grand Rapids. Both David and Shirley work as teachers there, and their children attend school. But come Friday, they are preparing themselves for when David arrives home.
David McIntyre teaches computer science at a nearby junior college. He says he loves the work, but on Friday afternoons, his mind drifts toward the lake. That's why they have their weekend getaways planned with the precision of a bank robbery.
I think it looks pretty good. Everybody knows what has to be done, and everyone has some jobs to do. For instance, if we're going to bake some food or make some cookies or muffins or something, then usually Heather and often Jonathan too will help in the kitchen. Oh, it's hot. And Heather's also great about helping with laundry at this point. If everything is done when David gets home, we can leave immediately and we have more time at the boat. So it benefits everyone if everyone is involved and helps.
Heather and Jonathan, are you ready?
Yeah!
Your dad will be pleased. We're ready on time. Yeah.
Grand Rapids is somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes inland. And they can drive in their car, leave at 4 o'clock, and they're at the lake by 5 o'clock.
Well, I think we're pretty fortunate. It's just a short drive and very convenient. It's no problem at all.
The McIntyres have had a series of boats, a 19-footer, then 27, now 30 feet.
For us, it's our cottage, and we like the idea of being able to move our cottage around from port to port.
Great. Thanks.
We chose sailing because it provides us with a fairly inexpensive means of transportation. We don't have to be in a hurry to get anywhere, and you can't be when you're sailing.
You can throw off, Jonathan.
Heather just recently had a class and got her license to drive the boat alone, which she probably won't be doing for a few years, but she loves to take the helm. One of her favorite activities now is just taking us out of the slip and running us out of the channel. And of course, Jonathan wants to pitch in and handle the winches as much as he can. He'll take the wheel as often as possible as well. So more and more they're getting involved in sailing the boat.
I think my greatest satisfaction would be that we're all doing something that we enjoy doing and we're doing it together. And secondly, it's so restful that it really kind of restores me, and I think it restores David. The dunes are a favorite place for the children. Often you'll find many boats over there, not just a few, but many boats over there.
Do you want anything on it? No.
And it's fun just to go over to the sand dunes and eat lunch someplace different.
Pickles are good. Thanks. Well, I can't take credit.
We've got a marvelous resource here in the Great Lakes. You know, we don't have a lot of the worries that that some of the other places have as far as in salt water and corrosion and damage to equipment and so on. And I can really get a feel for being out and sailing on the 7 Seas. You know, we have just miles and miles of open waterway out there to cover. And I can't imagine living in Michigan anymore and not being out on Lake Michigan.
And people have been attracted to it for a long time. 100 years ago, the immensity of the lake's potential brought succeeding waves of settlers to prosperity here. The Dutch settled along Michigan's western shore. Lithuanians moved south to Beverly Shores, Indiana. Belgians went to Brussels, Wisconsin. And of course, Germans settled in Wisconsin too, many in Milwaukee. The driftwood arrived there just in time for a celebration.
Milwaukee, I had always, I guess, imagined it from the TV show Happy Days. That was its location, and I don't know what I really thought about it before I went there. But arriving there, a nice town with a lot of German feeling about it. German buildings, and the first thing I thought of was, you know, Oktoberfest, and a real festive town.
Behind the beer and brats, what they found in Milwaukee was a story that caught them by surprise. They discovered the city is an international port. That's because when the St. Lawrence Seaway was finished in 1959, it opened the Great Lakes to the Atlantic and to the world. Now, every month, Russian ships arrive at the port of Milwaukee, carrying Soviet-made tractors into America's heartland. 20 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Now, about 3,000 tractors a year are being delivered to a Belarus distribution plant in suburban Milwaukee. Belarus is a Russian company, part of the world's largest tractor manufacturer. It's also the only Soviet-owned company in the United States. Smokey Harrison left a contracting business in Texas to become general manager for Belarus. Working for the Soviet Union wasn't an idea that came naturally to him.
It is a Soviet product. There's no question about that. It's not like selling John Deere or Case. It's just around the corner.
But what convinced Smokey was value per dollar.
I've come to the realization that in behalf of the American farmer, it's probably the best thing that could be done right now. It's their best buy on the market today, dollar for dollar for ag use.
Belarus tractors sell for roughly 25% less than comparable American-made models. Meanwhile, this Russian company is employing about 60 Americans. An exception is Alex Gavrilovich. He's one of 4 Russian technicians on hand to oversee the final assembly of the tractors.
My job here, make a work of tractor healthy, you know, because tractor is also like man. Even tractors has a different faces. Looks like same design, but health different. I work like tractor's doctor, you know.
In their 2-year stay, the technicians try and soak up some Americana. Parts manager Mary Smeal knows that.
One of the most interesting things when you get a technician in here is how they want to learn American slang. I used to always say, oh, it's a piece of cake, whenever the technicians used to say, oh, it's easy. And they'd say, no, not a piece of cake. I want no cake now. We working.
Yes, very nice.
The technicians takes lots of pictures. And the reason they do that is because when they go back, they want to have all those memories and they want to remember everybody that was really special to them.
New Year party. That's my wife, Paula again, and my daughter too. Well, Guy, are you ready?
The Russians bring their families with them. During their stay, they get to understand a bit about life in this international port in the center of the continent.
Ready? We've been in a museum We've been in a library. We've been even on a Miller Company and tasted American beer.
Are you ready?
Today, it's a family trip to Summerfest, one of Milwaukee's more famous celebrations.
Very nice. You look like star.
I make a parallel between Summerfest and the last holiday in Minsk, my own town.
You will have a nice picture.
I really don't see any difference between people. If said like joke, also 2 hands and 2 legs, you know. We have same problem. We breathe with the same air. We need the sun, we need the blue sky, we need the joy for our kids.
The only problem that you find throughout the staff here, throughout the American staff, is that they get used to Soviet technicians. They become friends, and contrary to the popular belief that I was under when I come here, gee, they'd give the right arm if they come to the United States. That's not the case. They're just as eager to go home as we would be if we were in a foreign country.
Wish for all of you to find opportunity to go for Russia, to make trip. You will look what there. Now there, wonderful time. Желаю вам посетить Россию, Советский Союз, Белоруссию и Минск. Всего доброго. Bye-bye.
The Driftwood headed for the biggest port in the biggest city on the lake, Chicago, where people have dramatically altered the waterways and the landscape.
Traveling down, a lot of it is very flat above the shoreline. And then all of a sudden you begin to approach. I think we had seen the Chicago skyline about 5 miles out before we even made it into the inner harbor. And wherever you looked, it was there. You would look north, south, of course, to the west, but it was there. It was very impressive.
Like so many places around the Great Lakes, this great city's name comes from an Indian word, Chicago. What it meant isn't clear. Some experts say skunk or wild onion. Both were abundant here in Indian days. Others say Chicago meant big, great, or powerful, which it certainly is today. 8 million people live in the Chicago area. It is the commercial, financial, industrial, and cultural center of the American heartland and the crossroads of the continent. Chicago moves more goods and people than any other American city. One of its greatest assets is the lake with its 29 miles of shoreline and its beaches. Many Chicagoans take their beaches for granted, but they exist today only because the water is clean, clean enough to swim in. It wasn't always so. As Chicago grew up, it used its river as an open sewer that drained into Lake Michigan. In 1850, the Chicago River was known as Garlic Creek because of its foul smell. In 1885, a huge storm sent a flood of sewage into the city's water intake. 1 of every 8 people died as a result. That tragedy led to a major engineering feat, reversing the flow of the Chicago River with a lock system and a canal that connected it to the Illinois River and ultimately the Mississippi. And thus was born a terrible old joke. In St. Louis, they said, the glass of water you drank had already been through 5 people. In New Orleans, it was 10. Reversing the river and building the sanitary and shipping canal also gave Chicago and the rich Illinois farmlands a modern water route to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. There was only one glitch. The Chicago River was lined with low bridges.
At one time, the Chicago River had a great number of commercial barges and towboats and boats in general that would traverse the river itself. And the bridges would have to be raised and lowered at all hours of the day.
Movable bridges. Chicago has 52 of them, more than any other city in the world. And while there's not much commercial river traffic through downtown Chicago anymore, the bridges are still working.
And basically what they're opening for now is recreational boats, sailboats with large masts.
It's a spectacle that always draws a crowd. And the show couldn't go on without people like Kevin Kelly and Carl Bradshaw.
Both of them have been working for the city of Chicago as bridge tenders for about the same amount of time, close to 8 years. One thing you quickly learn is there is no love between a bridge tender and a motorist. You can have a traffic jam that may be somewhere in a quarter-mile length.
They should be down at all times. The bridge should be down at all times.
Federal law declares that river traffic has the right-of-way. Just about every day, Carl has to explain that to a frustrated citizen.
Any boat in the water, if he can't get out of there, you have to open on demand.
How often does this happen?
Whenever he comes.
Fortunately, traffic duty is just a small part of their job. The rest of the day, Kevin and Carl will be doing what they know best, lifting the downtown bridges.
There's 12 bridge tenders, and they're split into 6 teams of 2, and each team has a city car and a city radio, a marine radio.
This is Rover 4. We're on our way. We're on Grand Avenue, headed for Michigan Avenue.
They call themselves rovers, roving bridge tenders. The job developed because the city can't afford to man all the bridges around the clock.
Carl and I will lift one bridge, like, say, we'll lift Dearborn, and then we've got 4 or 5 bridges to skip until we lift our next bridge, so it's a game of leapfrog. So you have to really know your way around the city, the one-way streets and the shortcuts, so you hope that we get to the bridge before the boats get to the bridge.
Kevin handles one side, Carl the other.
Let's get started, Kelly.
Okay, my on-roadway gate's down.
My barrier's going down. Okay, it's down. All right. You brake. All right, I'm braking.
KC 2479, Rover 4 to Randolph and all Rovers, Lake Street's going up, Lake going up. This style of bridge is a double leaf bascule bridge. It was designed and invented in Chicago, so the engineers from all over the world will come to Chicago to look at it. It's called a Chicago-style bascule bridge. I think bascule means teeter-totter in French because the bridges are balanced so like a teeter-totter. This will be the last one here with the blue.
You would think there would be this huge machine motor that would raise and lower the bridge, and as it turns out, they use something like they could use a 100-horsepower Volkswagen engine to do the lifting and lowering of the bridge.
The beauty of the design is that the 2 bridge leaves, each weighing millions of pounds, are finely balanced by counterweights sunk into an underground pit. The engineering is so precise that the bridge must be rebalanced every time it is painted.
I turned the traffic loose.
And you might think it would take an engineering degree to do what Kevin and Carl do. Not so. When they started, the most important requirement was that you have the right connections.
I worked for the alderman for a couple of years.
Once he was able to prove to this alderman that he was able to collect enough votes for him, then he was able to get his bridge tending job.
And I didn't even know what a bridge tender was until my first day on the job. So it's not like I chose to be a bridge tender. It's just I sort of fell into it.
Carl landed his job in much the same way. Bridge tending is actually his second career. He spent 30 years as a union organizer and fought a lot of battles on behalf of workers. He had one of his own to fight when he became a bridge tender.
There were some bridges that there were just unwritten laws that black operators didn't operate at, and we sort of understood that. But me being the kind of guy not to tolerate those kind of things, I started right off the bat fighting those kind of situations.
He's seen it go from a time where whites were on certain bridges and blacks were on certain bridges to a point now where the whole system is integrated.
How many do you see there? Well, that's another one. Do you see him coming?
It takes about 2 years to learn the job. Every bridge is different, and you have to know what to do if something goes wrong.
Yeah, but I ain't got no cutoff on this side. I'm gonna try it again, Kelly.
There we got it. Your responsibility is to operate a $25 million piece of equipment alone. You have to keep your wits about you. You have to pay close attention. And above all, you have to have safety at all times.
And that's a sensitive topic among Chicago bridge tenders. They had nearly 30,000 lifts last year without a major incident. But they still get a bad rap because of an accident involving a cab driver a while back.
What the driver did, the cab driver, not being familiar with Chicago bridges, drove almost across the bridge, and there's a barrier that comes down that he could have knocked off had he just drove on. But I think he panicked and put his car in park. When the bridge went up, it turned him over, and when it come back down, it crushed him.
That's Carl's version of the events. The city said the bridge tender was drunk and fired him. Cars are a problem in regard to safety, but both Carl and Kevin are adamant that the biggest threat to safety comes from the man and woman on the street.
I was at the Madison Street Bridge once, and I raised the bridge, and coming down, there were people late for a train, so the bridge was still up about 10 degrees, and people started making a run for it, about 10 people. And there was one guy that jumped across the gap of about 4 feet, and he was putting his hand out, helping people run across the bridge. And so people were willing to risk their lives just to catch a train.
I think the main thing with the bridge operation is that the people on the street pay damn little attention to the bells and the lights. They're in a hurry to go to lunch, or they're in a hurry to get to work, or they're in a hurry to get home.
But for the most part, the job is quiet. And it takes a certain type of personality.
It's a solitary type job, or you're with one partner all the time. And a lot of times you're just by yourself in a bridge, so it is, you do have a lot of time to think. You can compare it to like a lighthouse, someone at lighthouse keepers on their 24-hour man bridges.
The Driftwood crew left Chicago with a new appreciation of bridge tenders and movable bridges. Now they were heading for a low bridge that couldn't open, which meant the crow's nest had to come down.
It seemed like the coldest day of the year. It was really windy, and I almost thought it was too windy to take the crow's nest down.
The Driftwood set out at dawn on a chilly fall morning. She headed south to Calumet Harbor on the city's southern end. Along the way, the Driftwood crew got a first-hand look at the effects of an economy in transition.
What we had witnessed was a lot of buildings that were closed, shut, gates bolted, closed. It was an impressive yet sad sight to see, being that the industry at one time, when it was at its peak, was the backbone of a lot of this area of the country, and now it has dwindled down to the point where only a few of the steel factories are still in operation.
Charlena Lovett worked at a U.S. steel plant for 9 years before she was told she was no longer needed.
When I started at U.S. Steel, there was 11,000 people working. Now I hear there's only 1,200 working now. But I thought by the time I got at the steel mill, you know, things would be a whole lot better for me because of the money and everything. But all that was shot down when I got laid off.
Charlena worked at anything she could find, but it never paid enough, not with 2 children to care for and a husband who'd been laid off too.
And we started arguing a lot about money, which was our biggest problem, was money. But what can I say? The marriage fell apart.
So did her family. Charlena wound up moving in with her mother, alone.
My oldest daughter, she and my youngest daughter chose to stay with my husband because it was easier for my youngest daughter to go to school from his house. But It was hard. It was hard. Like I said, it's devastating to one day wake up and you've got a lot of money in the bank, and then to wake up the next day and you don't have 2 cents in there.
Like it's done to a lot of people around the country, changes in the steel industry have given Charlena Lovett some hard knocks, but she's not given up. She's working part-time as a practical nurse and going to school to become a registered nurse.
I also plan to open up my own agency one day where you can have different nurses going to different places working for you. I plan to buy a home. If I don't hurry up, I won't get it. And my biggest plan is I'd like to see both of my girls go to school and get a college degree.
It took a lot of courage for her to go back to school and, you know, to get a new job and to have that ambition and desire to keep pushing. So it just shows stamina that most people hope to have.
Kathy and Bill discovered that not all industrial stories around here were unhappy. People told them they felt the steel industry was making a quiet comeback, but that things would never again be what they were a decade or two ago. The driftwood headed south down the Calsag Channel. It's a waterway that was dug in the early 1900s to provide another link from Chicago to the Illinois River and the Mississippi. Now, you'll remember the crew of the driftwood took down the crow's nest in Chicago for good reason.
It was a real guessing game when you see a bridge coming up and he's yelling back to you, can we make it, can we make it? And you're, well, if I say yes, you know, and it doesn't, then you feel pretty bad, but you're just getting in there and then all of a sudden it clears and it's the best feeling to touch, you know, the bottom of the bridge.
As the boat headed down the Illinois, it passed through some of the most diversely forested land in the state. Each spring and fall, some 20 species of water birds spend time here. Unfortunately, the crew of the driftwood didn't have much time to bird watch. This is a very busy waterway. Back in 1935, it transported nearly 2 million tons of cargo. Today, it carries over 40 million tons of grain, coal, oil, and steel products every year.
I was surprised at the amount of traffic. I never realized that they used it that much. And when you're in a pleasure craft, you make sure that they have enough room.
The waterway drops 100 feet over the first 60 miles. It takes a series of 8 locks and dams to create a constant depth of 9 feet. And it takes considerable effort to maintain it. Every year, the Army Corps of Engineers hauls out nearly 500,000 cubic yards of silt. This mountain of muck not only threatens the waterway, it's turning backwater recreation areas of the Illinois into mud flats. Near Peoria, the river widens to nearly a mile to form Peoria Lake. Today, the lake's volume is only 1/3 of what it was 20 years ago. And that's affected the lives of Tom and Donna Coates.
They are just two people, isolated people, and they will go out in their runabout boat and fish for mussels, and they're dealing with this problem also.
We want the river to be to where our kids can enjoy it as much as what we did when we were growing up. We respect it.
Donna Coates describes herself as a river rat. She, her husband Tom, and their friend Rick all grew up on the Illinois. And what they see on their river worries them.
See, it settled in so bad that this lake over here at one time used to be about 6 foot deep. And now, it's about 3 foot of water over there, 2 foot at the most. Well, it's about
Rick remembers what it used to be like around here when his father and grandfather hauled in carp and catfish as commercial fishermen.
There used to be a market down here at one time that 100,000 pounds of fish a week going through it wasn't nothing, you know.
It'd just be too tough to make a living commercial fishing right now.
It just ain't worth it. You go out there and freeze to death and you might make $50.
So we just go ahead and work and just kind of have that as a hobby and catch enough to eat and have a fish probably once in a while.
But these mussels are not edible. It's the shells they're after.
You get down there and it's just like having your eyes closed. You can't see a thing. It's just a whole new world down there. All quiet.
I keep a constant eye on the pressure of his air tanks, make sure the compressor is running. If his air pressure gets low, then I bring him up.
What shells they find are eventually sold to the Japanese, who granulate and use them as seed to make pearls and oysters. There's no living in this for Tom and Donna, so he works at a construction job to support them. If he had his way, he'd prefer to spend his time on the river, even on a cold day like this, near the end of the season.
Nothing down there. Wasn't any down there.
Some experts say fishermen are taking too many shells out of the water, that there's a real danger of overtaxing the Illinois River's mussel beds. Naturally, Tom Coates has a different point of view.
It's not us guys taking too many. It's the pollution and silting in that's killing them all.
They put all this weed killer and all that on, you know, off these fields, and then when it rains, where's that stuff going to go? Right in the Illinois River, you know. And that's a lot of it's killing the fish and your mussels and a lot of, you know, a lot of things.
It's sad.
Poison.
It's sad, like when Tom brings up a bag of shells, you might empty it out and they'll all be dead. Pretty soon there'll be no season at all. I see it in the future, they won't even let you dive on them.
Not far downriver is Illinois' third largest city, Peoria. This industrial center of 125,000 grew up on river traffic, but in recent times it's gone through a decline. In the days of vaudeville, Peoria was the American city. Will it play in Peoria was show business shorthand for, will this act appeal to middle American tastes? Today, the city is known around the world for one name, Caterpillar, maker of diesel engines and heavy earth-moving equipment.
We toured around the Caterpillar company, and it fit the image that you would have of a Caterpillar industry.
Like many aging North American cities, Peoria has taken its lumps. In the early 1980s, Caterpillar failed to earn a profit for the first time in 50 years.
Most of the people in the city work at Caterpillar. If they don't do well, then the city doesn't do well.
Caterpillar's production lines were busy again when the driftwood came through, but to get back in the black, deep cuts had been made. You could feel the effects. It looked like a city struggling to get back on its feet. Navigating out of Peoria proved difficult because the silt in the river had lowered the water level. Following directions, Driftwood's Captain Bristol made his way under a bridge. Then came an unhappy sound. The driftwood hit a concrete obstruction on the bottom.
It damaged one of the props to the point where the vibration on the boat was astronomical. So that slowed driftwood down the entire rest of us transiting down the Illinois into the Mississippi.
While the captain investigated the damage, Bill and Kathy had time to get off the driftwood and explore. On the river near Peoria, they found a place called Wildlife Prairie Park. It's a private nature and animal reserve. It concentrates on the plants and animals once native to Illinois and now rarely seen by most people. The park is the pet project of William Rutherford, a Peoria attorney and former director of the Illinois Department of Conservation. He opened it with his own money and contributions.
He's created not so much a zoo, but a nature walk. You don't see animals in cages. You don't see animals in little cubicles. They're all in a nice area that the animals feel very at home at.
We want to show people some of the things that made Illinois what it is. Many people in Illinois don't realize we had mountain lions.
Mom, come here.
We call them cougars or panthers or puma. There are lots of different names. But they were native here, along with the bobcat and the otter and the badger and the black bear.
And even the sleepy possum, all of which the Rutherfords have brought to their park for people to enjoy.
He hasn't just given something to the public, but he's also helped a lot of the animals try to make it off the endangered species list.
The Rutherfords think the best way for city dwellers to learn respect for the environment is to show them what they're missing.
Wildlife Prairie Park is an effort to put in tangible, understandable form some of the concepts so people come out and feel it, and enjoy it, and partake of it, and learn about nature without preaching to them. You ask about what's happening to this beautiful Illinois River and this marvelous lake that you see. That was the place the French explorers said had the most wildlife they had seen anywhere in their exploration, which would be a tragedy if we lost it for central Illinois beside just Peoria. But what's even worse, filling up with silt is a symptom of a more critical disease, because the loss of topsoil means we will eventually lose our agricultural capability, the ability to feed this part of the world or much of the world.
All along the Illinois, the driftwood crew observed the bounty of this landscape. Yet it began to seem to them the harvest comes at great cost to the river environment. So far, everyone they talked to pointed fingers at Illinois farmers for causing the problems of the river. And so they sought another point of view in Havana, Illinois. The town is surrounded by some of the world's richest farmland.
I had never seen grain elevators before, and pretty well the first thing you see in Havana is the grain elevators. You know, just this immense sound of the grain pouring into and hitting the steel. And how some of that grain is just shipped off and it goes and feeds the world. And it was just pretty amazing.
Just outside Havana, Bill and Kathy met Stoney Adkins. His family works a large farm, 3,300 tillable acres. Stoney has $500,000 tied up in the equipment he uses to grow corn, soybeans, wheat, and popcorn. All but the popcorn is transported to market on the river. Stoney saw Bill Arnold jump as a tractor went by.
You got Miss Canadian, you're behind me. I get squashed before you.
If I was ever gonna start a farming business, I'd want Stoney Atkins to run it for me. He has been doing it for so many years that he can read the land. You know, he doesn't have to worry about the weather chart.
The farming industry right now today is making terrific advances in the control of pollution, of insecticides, chemical fertilizer, and all those things that would pollute the water supply. And it's critical to us because unknown to people like in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, right here where we live, I drive a pipe in the ground 25 feet, put an electric pump on it. I drink the water out of that ground that I farm. It's just as critical to me as it is to anyone in a urban area.
Ask Stoney about agricultural runoff and the silting in of the Illinois River.
We have to change our practices. We have to change the old wives' tale, so to speak, of the old type farming, and we are.
Yet even if farmers clean up their act, Stoney insists, the siltation problem won't go away. He says it's too big for farmers to take all the blame. The big city that flushes its waste down the river is also responsible.
So we're all in a great big game together. And the federal people say that they are not going to pay for keeping rivers cleaned out anymore. If they do not, then we're into a real trouble.
Each day, the Illinois becomes a little more shallow. If nothing is done, there may be a time when Stoney can't get his grain downriver from the elevators in Havana. And if that were to happen, the town of Havana would have to adapt to a new situation, as it has done before. Havana wasn't always dominated by agribusiness. Once it was a hot little town.
I know it had 23 taverns. There was a lot of fighting. Houses of prostitution along the highway up here. We had a lot of gambling and a lot of bootlegging joints in the days of bootlegging. Matter of fact, I made a lot of stills myself. I was in the plumbing business in those days.
George and Virginia Carl grew up in Havana. He ran the hardware store. Havana has given George and Virginia a lifetime of memories.
This is the steamer Peoria and the barge Pearl. Well, the barge Pearl was strictly a dance barge. This is a picture of the Taylor House, and this is the place where they had the continuous poker games.
Run for years.
They just keep going.
One man would get out, and another man would sit down.
The high times finally came to an end on the governor's broomstick.
Halloween night, 1950, the governor sent in the police and closed it down, and we haven't had any, to my knowledge, since.
Well, we always called that trick-or-treat night. That closed up the gambling. And really, Havana's a different town entirely since we don't have gambling. It took the little lush off, you know.
Virginia Carl rather enjoyed the raucous times in her river town. With a twinkle in her eye, she told the crew of the Driftwood that she used to see people win once in a while in Havana's old gambling joints. She's never met anybody who's won today's state lottery. Out of Havana, the Driftwood limped south through shallow water toward the Mississippi. Bill and Kathy had many feelings about what they'd seen on their 300-mile trip down the Illinois Waterway.
When I came down to Middle America, as it were, I wasn't so surprised at what I saw. I think I could have been traveling pretty well anywhere in Canada. People gave me the same sort of feeling, very friendly, and they welcomed you, and you felt like one of the family. The only difference that I found was maybe the accent, and the license plates were different.
From the Straits of Mackinac to Alton, Illinois, the Driftwood traveled 650 miles. From cool waters of the north, through the big city, and into a river system that passes through America's agricultural heartland. At the end of the journey, the Driftwood entered the lock on the Mississippi River outside Alton. As she closed one chapter of her voyage, the Driftwood was ready to begin another. In the weeks ahead, join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel more than 25,000 miles and rediscover the stories along the waterways that link the people of North America with one another and the rest of the world. Come along as they explore man's relationship with the water he treasures and despoils, plays with and fights with, and cannot live without. Join these young people on the next leg of On the Waterways.
Funding for this program was provided by the Bamana Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana.